The stagecoach lurched to a stop in the middle of nowhere, and Rose Hayes stepped out into the blazing New Mexico sun with $12 in her coat pocket and a folded recipe card pressed against her heart, wondering if she had just made the most magnificent or most foolish decision of her 24 years on this earth. The year was 1878, and the territory of New Mexico was not a place for the faint of heart. It was raw and vast and ancient, the kind of land that swallowed whole the weak-willed and the unprepared, and spit them back out as bleached bones alongside the wagon ruts. Rose Hayes was neither weak-willed nor unprepared, but standing on the sun-baked main street of Cobber Creek, population 200 and some change, she felt the enormity of her gamble settle into her bones like the desert heat itself. She had come from St. Louis, from a narrow townhouse on a narrow street where she had spent the better part of her adult life cooking meals for her aunt and uncle, mending their clothes, tending to their house, and slowly, quietly, disappearing into the wallpaper. When her Aunt Meredith had passed in the spring of that year, Rose had inherited two things: $12 in coin that the old woman had tucked away in a sugar bowl, and a handwritten recipe card for something Meredith called her territorial honey cake, a recipe she had developed during the 3 years she spent in the New Mexico territory as a young woman before circumstances drew her back east. "You have her wandering spirit," Rose's Uncle Gerald had said on the evening of the funeral, not unkindly but not warmly either. "Lord knows this house cannot hold a woman with a wandering spirit." It was not an invitation to leave, exactly, but it was close enough to one that Rose had taken it. She had spent 3 days doing nothing but reading her aunt's old letters, letters full of descriptions of Red Canyon walls and the smell of pine and juniper on cool mornings, of a land so different from the gray stone and soot of St. Louis that it might as well have been another world entirely. There had been a town in those letters, a place her aunt described with particular fondness, a town called Cobber Creek that sat in the foothills of the mountains and had, according to Meredith's aging correspondence, a shortage of good cooking and an abundance of hungry people who would pay for it. The idea had taken root slowly and then all at once. Rose had purchased a stage ticket with 3 of her $12 and packed everything she owned into one traveling trunk and one carpet bag. She had said goodbye to Gerald, who had kissed her cheek with genuine if slightly relieved affection, and she had climbed aboard a stage in St. Louis and not looked back. 4 days of hard travel later, here she was. Cobber Creek was a collection of adobe buildings and timber-frame storefronts arranged along a single main road that ran east to west. There was a general store, a blacksmith shop, a land office, a small adobe church with a rusted bell, a saloon that looked like it had seen better days and was proud of it, and a scattering of houses and outbuildings spreading back from the main road toward the foothills. Dust swirled in the narrow alleys between buildings. A dog slept in the shadow of the porch overhang of the general store. 2 men sat in chairs outside the saloon and squinted at Rose with the particular disinterest of men who had seen enough newcomers arrive and fail that they had stopped investing any emotion in the arrival itself. Rose picked up her carpet bag and straightened her hat and walked toward the general store, because that seemed like the most logical place to begin. The man behind the counter was short and barrel-chested with a white mustache and small, kind eyes. He introduced himself as Mr. Horace Finch, proprietor of Finch's General, and he looked at Rose with the cautious politeness of a man who had learned long ago to reserve his judgment. "I have just arrived," Rose said. "I am looking for work and for a place to stay, and I have a question about whether there is any commercial space available in this town." Mr. Finch stroked his mustache. "Commercial space," he repeated, as though the phrase was mildly exotic. "What kind of work you thinking about, miss?" "Hayes, Rose Hayes. I am a baker and a cook. I make very good food. I have a recipe for a honey cake that my aunt developed in this very territory, and I intend to put it and several others to use in a proper establishment." Horace Finch looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the carpet bag. He looked at her traveling coat, which was plain but well-made, and spoke to a woman of modest but respectable means. And then something in his expression shifted from cautious to thoughtful. "Mrs. Dawson's old building," he said slowly, "at the east end of the road there. She ran a boarding house in it until she died 2 winters back. The front room was always meant to be a proper eating establishment. She just never got around to finishing it. The owner is a man named Thomas Ellsworth. He runs the cattle operation east of town. He has been meaning to do something with the property but has not gotten around to it either. Men on cattle operations rarely get around to things that are not cattle." "Would he sell it or rent it?" Rose asked. "He might rent it if the terms were right. He is a reasonable man, opinionated but reasonable." Horace Finch leaned on his counter. "You can find him most mornings at the saddle shop, 2 buildings down. He comes in every Tuesday to collect his mail from the stage and stops for coffee. Today is Tuesday." Rose thanked him, bought a small wedge of cheese and a bread roll with 15 cents, and sat on the bench outside the general store to eat her lunch and gather her thoughts. The sun was warm on her face. The air smelled of dust and dry sage and something she could not identify, something mineral and clean that she thought might be what the desert itself smelled like up close. She was going to make this work. She had to. The saddle shop was dim and smelled of leather and oil, and Thomas Ellsworth was sitting on a wooden stool near the window with a tin cup of coffee and what appeared to be a deeply boring conversation about fence posts with the saddle maker, a thin Cherokee man named Samuel Bird, who acknowledged Rose's entrance with a nod, and then excused himself with admirable tact to find something to do in the back room. Thomas Ellsworth stood when she entered. He was tall, somewhere in the rangy lean-way that the territory seemed to produce, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of good creek water on a cloudy day, that particular shade between gray and green that changed depending on the light. He was 30 years old. Rose would learn later, though he looked older than that in the way that men who worked outdoors did, weathered but not worn, the sun having only drawn the lines of his face more clearly rather than collapsing them. He wore a plain work shirt and canvas trousers and boots that had been resoled twice, and his hat was pushed back on his head with the casualness of a man who had forgotten it was there. He was not what she would have called handsome in the conventional sense, but there was something about the directness of his gaze and the steadiness in his bearing that she noticed, quite against her will, in the first 10 seconds of looking at him. "Mr. Ellsworth," she said, because Horace Finch had described him well enough that she knew. "My name is Rose Hayes. I have just arrived on the stage from St. Louis. Mr. Finch tells me you own the Dawson property on the east end of the road. I would like to discuss leasing it." Thomas Ellsworth looked at her with an expression that was neither dismissive nor particularly welcoming, but was, she decided, at least genuinely attentive. He sat back down on his stool and gestured to the only other chair in the shop, which was a 3-legged affair near the door that looked structurally dubious. "St. Louis," he said. "That is a long way to come to lease a building." "It is," Rose agreed, sitting carefully in the chair which held, "but I have good reasons." "What reasons?" "I intend to open a bakery and eating establishment. I am a skilled cook. I understand the building has a front room that was meant to serve as a dining area. I would like to put it to that use." Thomas turned his coffee cup between his hands. He had large, capable hands, she noticed, the kind that were accustomed to work. "That building has been empty for 2 years," he said. "The kitchen is in passable shape. The front room needs some work. The roof over the back needs patching." "I am not asking for it to be perfect," Rose said. "I am asking for it to be usable. In exchange, I am willing to pay a fair rent, which I can begin once the establishment is generating income. I am also willing to pay a portion of the improvements out of my own earnings." "How much capital do you have?" he asked, not unkindly, just directly. There was a moment of silence. Rose weighed the options. She could lie, she could hedge, she could obscure. She looked at the steadiness in his gray-green eyes and decided none of those were the right approach with this particular man. $12, she said. Thomas Ellsworth was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with something that might have been surprise if it had been on a more expressive face, and instead came out looking like a man who was recalculating something in his head. $12, he repeated. And a recipe, Rose said. She reached into her coat and drew out the folded card, slightly worn at the edges from the journey, covered in her aunt's looping handwriting. My aunt spent 3 years in this territory as a young woman. She developed this recipe here. It is for a honey cake. It is very good. I also have 23 other recipes in my memory that I have been cooking since I was 12 years old, and not one of them is mediocre. She put the card on the knee of her traveling skirt and looked at Thomas Ellsworth levelly. He looked at the card. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that she could not entirely name, a flicker of something between amusement and consideration, and what might, if she was reading it correctly, have been a kind of reluctant respect. $12 and a recipe, he said slowly. That is enough to begin, he said, and the way he said it made her heart do something unexpected and entirely inconvenient. It was not that he said it with certainty, though he did. It was not that he said it with warmth, though there was something almost warm in it. It was that he said it as though he meant it completely, as though $12 and a recipe, in the hands of the right person, were genuinely sufficient to build something real in the red dust of the New Mexico territory. Rose Hayes looked at Thomas Ellsworth and thought, quietly and privately, that this was either the most promising thing anyone had said to her in a very long time, or she was simply so exhausted from 4 days on a stage that she was reading things into a practical man's practical words. She decided to believe the first and guard against the second and shake his hand. They shook hands. His grip was firm and brief, and his hand was warm from the coffee cup, and Rose Hayes told herself firmly that she noticed none of these things. The Dawson building was exactly as Thomas had described it. The kitchen was passable, the front room needed work, and there was a section of the back roof that looked at the sky through a gap that a man could put his arm through. It also had a wood stove, a long work table, 2 windows with real glass still intact, and a deep stone sink fed by a hand pump that, with some persuasion, still worked. The front room was maybe 30 feet long and 15 feet wide, big enough for 4 tables with room to move between them. Rose walked through it twice in the late afternoon light and felt the particular settling in her chest that she associated with decisions that were right. Not easy, not certain, but right. Thomas had followed her through, pointing out what needed fixing and what he could arrange to have fixed. He had a practical, efficient way of speaking that she appreciated. He did not offer her pity or excessively cautious warnings. He told her the facts and let her make of them what she would. The floorboards in the southeast corner are soft, he said. I can have Billy Crane from the blacksmith shop reinforce them within the week. Thank you, Rose said. I have lumber for the roof already. It has been sitting in my barn for 6 months because I never got around to using it. He said this with a slight flatness that might have been self-deprecation. I will bring it in tomorrow. I do not want you to go to trouble on my account before I have even signed a lease. Thomas looked at her from across the empty front room. The afternoon light came through the western window and fell across the dusty floor between them. I am not going to trouble on your account, he said. I am going to repair a hole in the roof of a building I own, which I should have done a year ago. The fact that it coincides with your arrival is a practical matter. Rose smiled. She could not entirely help it. You are a very logical man, Mr. Ellsworth. I try to be, he said, and there was something in the slight shift of his expression that suggested the words had landed differently on him than they had on her. The lease was drawn up the next morning in the land office, witnessed by the land agent, a man named Porter who wore a string tie and smelled pleasantly of pipe tobacco. The terms were simple. Rose would pay $3 a month once her business was generating consistent income, which both parties agreed to define as at least 12 paying customers a week. Until that threshold was met, the building was hers to use and to improve, and Thomas would absorb the cost of the roof repair and the floorboards as investment in the property. It was, Rose thought, a remarkably fair arrangement. She signed her name clearly and looked up to find Thomas watching the signature with an expression she did not entirely understand. He nodded once. "Welcome to Cobber Creek, Miss Hayes." She spent the first week in a frenzy of cleaning and small repairs. She scrubbed the kitchen from floor to ceiling with water heated on the wood stove, organized the shelves, inventoried what equipment was salvageable from Mrs. Dawson's abandoned supplies, and made a list of what she needed to purchase. She acquired 4 mismatched tables and 12 chairs from Mr. Finch, who had been storing them in his back room since a previous tenant had left them behind, and she paid 2 of the older boys from the Mexican families at the edge of town to help her haul them in and arrange them. She sewed curtains from unbleached muslin she bought at the general store and hung them in the front windows. She repainted the front door herself, a clean white that stood out cheerfully against the adobe brown of the building's exterior. Thomas appeared on the 3rd day with 3 men and the lumber he had promised, and they repaired the roof in a morning while Rose worked in the kitchen below, the sound of hammering above her providing a kind of irregular accompaniment to her work. At midday she brought out a plate of biscuits she had made on the wood stove and a pot of coffee, and the men fell on them with the gratitude of people who had been eating their own cooking for too long. Thomas took a biscuit and held it for a moment before eating it, and she noticed the slight change in his expression when he tasted it, a kind of quiet, honest surprise. "These are very good," he said. "That is the point," Rose said pleasantly. He looked at her with something in his expression that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood as one, and Rose went back inside before she could examine whether that mattered to her. It took her 10 days to feel ready to open. She spent 8 of those days testing and adjusting her recipes to account for the high altitude and dry air, which affected baking in ways she had not anticipated, learning by trial and error, and by asking Inez Gallardo, one of her Mexican neighbors, who had been cooking in the territory her whole life, and who took Rose's earnest questions as an invitation to a friendship that Rose accepted gratefully. Inez was 42 and had 5 children and a husband who worked at the copper mine 8 miles east of town, and she was the most practical woman Rose had ever met. She knew things about cooking at altitude that no cookbook from St. Louis would have taught Rose in a year of reading, and she shared them with a generosity that Rose found quietly astonishing. "You must add a little more liquid always," Inez explained, gesturing at the batter Rose was adjusting, "and less of the leavening. The air here does not behave the same as the air in the East. It is thinner. It is proud. You must treat it with respect." "Treat the air with respect," Rose repeated, writing this down in the small notebook she had started keeping. "Yes," Inez said with great seriousness, and then smiled. "Also your honey cake. I want to try this honey cake you have spoken about so much." Rose made the honey cake that evening and brought half of it to Inez's house, and watched Inez's family eat it with the focused, serious attention of good eaters who understood what they were tasting. Inez's eldest son, who was 16 and not given to complimenting things, said it was very good. Inez herself said it was excellent. Her husband Diego, who said very little at all, ate 2 slices and then a third, which Rose thought was the truest review she could have received. On the 10th day, Rose Hayes put a small painted sign in the window of the front room that said Hayes Eating House, open for breakfast and dinner, and she opened the door at 6 in the morning and waited. The first customers were 2 miners from the copper operation, men named Pete and Garrett who had heard about the new eating house from someone and came in looking skeptical and hungry. Rose gave them eggs fried in butter with biscuits and strong coffee and a slice of the honey cake to finish, and they paid their 20 cents each and left without saying much, but Pete came back at lunchtime and brought 4 of his colleagues. By the end of the first week, Rose had served 47 customers. Thomas Ellsworth came on the 5th day, which was a Friday. He came in the morning before the first wave of breakfast customers, when Rose was still setting up. She heard the door and looked up from arranging the silverware she had bought second-hand from Mr. Finch, and he was standing in the doorway in the morning light looking at the front room with an expression she could not read. "You have done considerable work in here," he said. "I have had considerable motivation," Rose said. She gestured at the nearest table. "Sit down. I will make you coffee." He sat. She made coffee on the stove and brought it out along with a small plate of the honey cake, which she had made fresh that morning, to have on hand for the day. Thomas wrapped both hands around the tin cup the way she had noticed was his habit, warming his hands even on a morning that was already warm. He looked at the honey cake with the same brief, honest attention he had given the biscuits and ate a small piece and was quiet for a moment after. "Your aunt made this," he said. "Yes. In this territory years ago. She said the pine honey was what made it." Rose sat across from him because the chairs were there, and the coffee was hot, and there was no particular reason not to. She wrote down the recipe just before she died. I think she knew she would not make it to an old age. She put her name on it and the year she developed it and the words, "For someone with a wandering spirit." Thomas looked at her over his coffee cup with that steady, unreadable gaze. "She meant you." "She meant whoever needed it," Rose said carefully. He nodded slowly. "I think she meant you." They sat in a quiet that was not uncomfortable, listening to the town begin to wake around them, the distant sound of the blacksmith starting his forge, the crows in the cottonwood trees along the creek bank behind the main road, somewhere a dog beginning its morning commentary on the state of the world. "How is the roof holding?" Rose asked because practical questions were safer than whatever else she might have asked. "Good," Thomas said. "Should hold through the winters now. The snow can get heavy in February." "I have never seen a New Mexico winter," Rose said. "You will," he said, and then seemed to hear himself because something shifted in his expression. "I mean by the time February comes." "I know what you meant," Rose said, and was glad of the coffee cup to look at. He came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and before long it became clear that the arrangement of Thomas Ellsworth appearing at Hayes' eating house on Tuesday mornings before the breakfast rush was simply a fact of Cobber Creek life, as established and unremarkable as the Tuesday mail stage. Rose told herself it was because he collected his mail on Tuesdays and the eating house was convenient. This was true. She told herself it was simply a matter of a building owner checking in on his property. This was also, technically, true. She did not examine the matter more carefully than that, because there were biscuits to make and coffee to grind and a business to run. An examination of complicated things was a luxury she had not yet earned. By the end of the first month, Rose had served over 200 customers. The word about her cooking spread the way word spreads in small places, which is to say everywhere at once and very fast. The miners came reliably every morning. The families from the Mexican settlement on the south edge of town began bringing their children on Sunday afternoons, when Rose made the honey cake and a sweetened rice pudding she had adapted from Inez's recipe. The ranchers and cowboys who came into Cobber Creek from the surrounding operations found that Hayes' eating house had the best coffee in the territory and beef stew that made the saloon's offering seem like something prepared by a man who did not particularly like food. She had, by the end of the 6 weeks, cleared $3 after expenses. She paid her first month's rent to Thomas with a feeling of pride so fierce it was almost aggressive. He looked at the money and then at her face when she handed it over and said, "You did not need to pay yet. We agreed on 12 customers a week." "I cleared $3 profit," Rose said. "I can pay my rent." Thomas folded the money and put it in his shirt pocket with the careful, slightly self-conscious air of a man who was not sure what to do with the feeling a woman handing him money with that expression on her face had produced in him. "All right," he said. "I wanted you to know I am serious," Rose added. "I knew you were serious," Thomas said, "when you told me you had $12 and a recipe and looked me in the eye like you were daring me to find that insufficient." Rose laughed, and it surprised both of them, the laughter coming out bright and real, and without the careful modulation she usually applied to her expressions around this particular man. Thomas looked at her laughter with an expression she could only describe as unguarded, as though he had not quite expected it and was not entirely sure what to do about the effect it was having on him. Then he looked away, out the window, at the main road. "Business is good, then," he said, in the tone of a man restoring a safer conversational territory. "Business is good," Rose agreed, in the tone of a woman who was going to let him. The trouble arrived, as trouble in the territory tended to, without particular announcement. His name was Gerald Webb, and he had been trying to acquire property on Cobber Creek's main road for the better part of a year. He was not a villain in any melodramatic sense, just a man with money and ambition, and the particular kind of confidence that comes from having had things go his way long enough to believe they would continue to. He had a dry goods operation in Santa Fe and wanted to expand, and the Dawson Building, sitting on its prime corner of the main road, was exactly what he wanted for a warehouse and distribution point. He arrived in Cobber Creek on a Wednesday in early October, 2 months after Rose had opened her doors, driving a fine buggy and wearing a city coat that was entirely inappropriate for the dust of the territory. He walked into Hayes' eating house at midday, ate a meal, paid for it without complaint, and then sat with his coffee and told Rose, in a pleasant, businesslike voice, that he was prepared to pay Thomas Ellsworth $300 for the Dawson Building, and that she should know this so that she might begin making alternate arrangements. Rose put down the coffee pot she was holding and looked at this man with a careful, steady calm that she was extremely proud of, given the fact that her heart had dropped approximately 6 inches into her stomach. "The building is currently under lease," she said. "Leases can be renegotiated," Webb said with a pleasant smile. "Especially at $300. I would suggest," Rose said, "that you take the matter up with Mr. Ellsworth directly." "I intend to," Webb said. He finished his coffee, tipped his hat, and left. Rose went into her kitchen and stood with her hands flat on the worktable and breathed deliberately for about 30 seconds. Then she took off her apron, told Inez, who had been helping in the kitchen that afternoon, that she would be back shortly, and walked to the land office, where Porter, the land agent, confirmed that yes, a lease was a legal document and could not simply be terminated by a sale without cause, but that if both parties agreed to dissolve it, there was nothing legally preventing Thomas Ellsworth from selling the building and Rose from finding herself without a space to work. $300 was a significant sum. It was 10 times what Rose could offer, and they both knew it. She went back to her eating house and she made the honey cake, because baking was the thing she did when she needed to think, and she thought, and what she arrived at was this: she could not match $300. She did not have $300 and would not have $300 for a long time. What she had was a legal lease and a business that was growing and a belief, which she examined carefully to make sure it was not simply wishful thinking, that Thomas Ellsworth was a man who honored his agreements. She decided to trust that. It was a significant decision. Thomas appeared on Tuesday morning, which was 3 days after Webb's visit, and Rose had the coffee ready when he came through the door, and she told him about Webb's offer directly, because she had decided that directness was the only sensible approach. Thomas sat at his usual table and listened with his hands around his coffee cup, and his expression that careful, neutral thing he did when he was actually thinking hard. When Rose finished speaking, he was quiet for a moment. "Webb came to the ranch yesterday," he said, Rose's hand stilled on the coffee pot, "and," Thomas looked up at her, "I told him the building was not for sale." Something loosened in Rose's chest that she had not realized was tight until it let go. She set the coffee pot on the table and sat down across from him, which was their established Tuesday morning practice, and said, "Thank you." "I did not do it for you," Thomas said, with the careful honesty that was characteristic of him. "I did it because selling the building to Webb while you had a legal lease and a running business would have been the wrong thing to do. "I know," Rose said, "but thank you anyway." Thomas looked at his coffee. "He will come back," he said. "Men like Webb do not take no for the first answer." "I know that too," Rose said. "Then we should be clear about what our options are," Thomas said, and she noticed the word "our," and she thought he noticed it too from the slight pause that followed it. "The lease protects you as long as you are meeting the terms, which you clearly are. Beyond that, there is not much legal complexity here. The building is mine, the lease is yours, and Webb does not have a claim on either." "What does worry you?" Rose asked, because she had learned to read the texture of his silences well enough to know that something did. Thomas turned his coffee cup. "Webb has a way of making things difficult for people who tell him no," he said. "Not illegal exactly, just difficult. He is the kind of man who can make it hard for a new business to get supplies, if he puts his mind to it." Rose absorbed this. Santa Fe was where most of the supply lines ran through for small operations like hers. If Webb had connections there, and a man with a successful dry goods operation almost certainly did, he could potentially make the sourcing of flour and sugar, and the other staples she depended on considerably more expensive or difficult. "Then I need to establish my own supply relationships," Rose said, "independently of anything that runs through Webb." Thomas nodded slowly. "Inez Gallardo's brother runs a trading operation out of Albuquerque," he said. "He is reliable and he does not deal with Webb. I can introduce you." Rose looked at him across the table. The morning light was coming through the muslin curtains and catching the gray-green in his eyes, and he was looking at her with an expression that she had learned over the course of 2 months of Tuesday mornings and occasional other encounters. Was Thomas Ellsworth being something more than practical? "You know her brother," Rose said. "I have bought cattle feed from him for 3 years," Thomas said. "He is a good man." "You were already thinking about this," Rose said, "before I brought up Webb." A pause. Thomas looked at his coffee. "I spoke to him 2 days ago," he said. "After Webb came to the ranch. I mentioned that you might be reaching out." Rose was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the main road of Cobber Creek was beginning its morning routines, horses being led from the livery, the blacksmith's forge taking its first breath of the day, the mail stage just visible as it rounded the eastern bend of the road. "Thomas," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the Mr. in front of it, and they both heard it. He looked up. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, not accusatorially, genuinely. Thomas Ellsworth looked at her for a moment with an expression that was, for him, unusually open. Something in it that was not quite the careful neutrality he usually maintained, something that had slipped its leash slightly in the quality of the morning light and the coffee and 2 months of Tuesday conversations. "Because you came to this territory with $12 and a recipe," he said slowly, as though he was working out the words as he spoke them, "and you made something out of it. And because you did not ask me to help you do that. You just did it, and I find that—" He stopped. He looked at his coffee again. "I find that admirable," he finished, and the slight flatness in the last word suggested that what he had originally been going to say was something more than admirable, and he had revised it at the last moment. Rose looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at him. "I find you admirable too," she said simply, and watched him go very still. They sat in the silence that followed with the careful, slightly electrified quality of two people who have said more than they intended and are not sure what to do about it. It was Inez who provided the somewhat comic resolution to this moment by appearing at the front door with a basket of eggs she had offered to bring for the morning breakfast. Looking at the two of them sitting together in the morning light with the expression of a woman who saw exactly what was happening and was quietly pleased about it. "Good morning," she said to both of them, perfectly pleasantly, and went to the kitchen, and Rose stood and picked up the coffee pot and went to attend to her morning preparations. And Thomas finished his coffee and stood and put on his hat and said good morning and left. Inez said nothing until the first customers arrived, and then she said quietly to Rose while they worked, "That man has been coming to your eating house every Tuesday morning for 2 months. He owns the building," Rose said. "He does not own the building on Wednesdays," Inez said pleasantly, "or any other day of the week, only Tuesdays." Rose did not say anything to this, but she thought about it for the rest of the day, and she thought about it in the evenings when she sat at the work table in her kitchen going over her accounts, and she thought about it in the way that things you are trying not to think about tend to occupy every spare moment of your consciousness. The contact with Inez's brother, a man named Carlos Vega, proved to be everything Thomas had indicated. Carlos ran a trading supply line between Albuquerque and the Northern Territories that was well established and, crucially, completely independent of Gerald Webb's networks. He arrived in Cobber Creek 3 weeks later with a wagon of supplies and a businesslike cheerfulness and a firm handshake, and he and Rose struck an agreement that same afternoon that secured her supply chain through the following spring at prices better than what she had been paying through the general store. Webb made one more attempt, about 3 weeks after his initial visit, this time approaching Rose herself with a revised proposition. He would, he said, pay her $200 to walk away from the lease, which she could use to establish a new operation elsewhere in the territory. Rose thanked him for his time and declined. Webb looked at her with the particular expression of a man who had expected money to solve his problem, and was irritated to discover that the woman he was dealing with had a clearer sense of what she was building than his $200 accounted for. He left Cobber Creek the following morning, and the general understanding in the town, communicated through the reliable network of people who noticed things and talked about them, was that he would not be back. November came to the territory with a cold snap that surprised Rose entirely despite Thomas's advance warning. The mornings were brilliant and sharp, the light hitting the red rock of the foothills with a clarity that took her breath away, even as her breath made small clouds in the air. She learned to bank the wood stove in the kitchen overnight to keep the pipes from freezing, and she added a pot of chili to her breakfast menu, because the miners wanted something hot and substantial in the new cold, and the chili sold out every morning by 8 o'clock. Business was, by any reasonable measure, good. She had 7 regular tables and was running out of chairs on busy evenings. Inez's eldest daughter, a girl of 18 named Maria, had come on as a helper 3 afternoons a week and was steady and capable, and had the additional quality of being cheerful, which Rose found increasingly indispensable as the demands on her attention grew. She was building something. She could feel it, the way you feel the solidity of ground under your feet after a long time on uncertain terrain. Thomas came on Tuesdays. They had long since stopped pretending that the Tuesdays were anything other than what they were, which was a standing arrangement between 2 people who wanted to see each other, and had arrived at the most socially legible excuse available to justify it. The conversations had deepened over the months, ranging from the practical to the personal in a gradual, unforced way that felt to Rose like something growing rather than something being constructed. She had learned things about him in pieces. That he had come to the territory 8 years ago from Virginia, at 22, with a letter of introduction to a cattle operation that had since gone under, leaving him to start his own. That he had built the operation from a dozen cattle and a borrowed horse corral into 140 head with 3 good men working for him. That he had never married, which surprised her less than it might have, because she was beginning to understand that Thomas Ellsworth was a man who was very particular about the things he committed to, which meant that, when he did commit to something, it was entirely and without reservation. She learned that he had a habit of reading at night, which she discovered when she found him in the land office one afternoon, turning the pages of a battered copy of Thoreau with the focused attention of a man who took books seriously. She learned that he was genuinely fond of the territory, not in a sentimental way, but in a deep, bone-level way, the way people are fond of the place that has most accurately reflected who they are. She told him in return about St. Louis, about her Aunt Meredith, whose wandering spirit she had inherited and whose recipe card she still kept in her coat pocket even now, a kind of talisman. About the years of cooking in other people's kitchens and the creeping, slow panic of watching herself disappear into other people's lives. I was becoming invisible, she said, on a Tuesday in mid-November when the frost was thick on the window glass and the coffee was particularly good. I do not mean dramatically, just quietly. I was doing everything right and becoming no one in particular. Thomas was quiet in the way he was when he was genuinely listening. "You are not invisible here," he said. "No," Rose agreed. "I am not." She looked at him across the table and he looked at her, and there was nothing uncertain in either of their expressions in that moment, nothing careful or hedged. Just two people who had arrived, through the slow and honest process of knowing each other, at something that was entirely clear. "Rose," Thomas said. "Yes," she said before he had said anything else, and then felt her face warm because that had rather revealed her position. Something in his expression did what she had been waiting, she realized, for quite some time to see. It opened. It just entirely opened, all the careful neutrality and the steadiness dropping away and leaving something underneath that was warmth and intention, and, she was quite certain, equal parts nervousness and conviction. "I would like to take you for a ride on Sunday," he said. "Out to the red rock formations east of the cattle operation. They are remarkable in the winter light. I have been wanting to show them to you since October." "Since October," Rose repeated. "I was working up to it," Thomas said, with a flatness that was entirely self-aware and made her laugh, that bright, unguarded laugh that she had stopped trying to contain. "Sunday," she said. "Yes," he smiled. It was not a large smile. Thomas Ellsworth was not a man who deployed his smiles extravagantly, which meant that the smiles he did produce had a quality of significance that more liberal smilers never achieved. It arrived in the corners of his eyes and in the slight easing of his whole expression, and Rose Hayes looked at it and felt warmth settle all the way through her, from her throat to her feet. Sunday arrived cold and brilliant, the sky that deep impossible blue of the territorial winter, cloudless and infinite. Thomas arrived at the eating house at 9 in the morning with 2 horses, a bay mare he had brought for Rose that was well-mannered and smooth-gaited, and his own dark roan gelding that she had seen him on before. Rose had borrowed Inez's riding skirt, a practical divided skirt that allowed for actual riding, and she had packed a small bundle, the honey cake, wrapped in cloth, a tin of coffee on a small thermos she had found among Mrs. Dawson's equipment, and her notebook. Thomas looked at the notebook with a slight questioning expression. "I like to draw what I see," Rose said, slightly defensive, as though she had been caught at something private. "What do you draw?" he asked. "Mostly landscapes, sometimes plants." "I am not very good." "I doubt that," Thomas said simply, and helped her mount the bay mare with a hand offered straightforwardly, his grip firm and brief. Though this time Rose noticed that the briefness was something slightly deliberate rather than instinctive, as though he had to remind himself to let go. The ride east took 40 minutes on a trail that climbed gradually through the foothills into a landscape that Rose had not yet fully seen, having been occupied with the practical concerns of the main road and the eating house since her arrival. The red rock formations that Thomas had described proved to be extraordinary, tall columns and arches of crimson sandstone that rose from the pale desert floor like the ruins of something immense and ancient, which Rose supposed they were. The winter light hit them at an angle that made the red almost luminous, burning from inside, and the shadows between them were a deep blue-purple that seemed to belong to a different painting entirely. Rose drew in a breath that was not quite voluntary and reached for her notebook before she had consciously decided to. Thomas watched her draw with a quietness that felt, she thought, like respect for what she was doing. He did not comment or talk, just sat on the roan at a little distance and let her have the experience of it, which was exactly right. They found a flat ledge of rock in the sun out of the wind, and Rose unpacked the honey cake and poured the coffee, and they sat side by side on the ledge with the red formations rising around them and ate and drank and talked. It was the most uncomplicated conversation they had yet had. Away from the town and the practical frameworks of buildings and leases and Tuesday mornings, the conversation could simply be what it was. They talked about Virginia and St. Louis and the territory. They talked about what they wanted, in the way that two people who are past the point of performing their best selves for each other and have arrived at the more interesting territory of honesty can talk about what they want. Thomas said he wanted the cattle operation to be something he could be proud of when he was old. He said this with the straightforwardness of a man who had long since made peace with the fact that ambition and simplicity were not mutually exclusive. Rose said she wanted the eating house to be a place people thought of when they thought of home. She said it carefully, watching his face as she said it because it was a more personal thing to say than she usually permitted herself. That is exactly what it already is, Thomas said, looking at her with that steady gray-green gaze. You think so? She was not fishing for reassurance. She genuinely wanted his assessment, which she had come to trust. The miners on the early shift eat at your place and they are different after than before, Thomas said. Not different in a dramatic way. Just more themselves. That is what good food in a good place does. You have already done that. Rose looked at the honey cake in her hands and thought about her Aunt Meredith, who had sat somewhere in this same territory 60 years ago and worked out that flour and butter and the particular honey of this place and time could make something that carried meaning beyond its ingredients. She thought about the recipe card in her coat pocket, worn at the edges from all the traveling it had done. She would have liked this, Rose said quietly. Your aunt? Yes, she would have liked all of this. The territory. The eating house. She looked at the view, then at Thomas. She would have liked you, I think. Thomas looked at her for a moment. That is a generous thing to say. It is an accurate thing to say, Rose said. I do not offer generous things as a habit. I prefer accurate ones. He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as Thomas working out how to say something direct when the direct thing was also large. He set down his coffee tin on the rock between them and turned slightly to face her, and the afternoon sun was warm on the red stone and on his face. Rose, he said. Thomas, she said back just his name, letting it carry everything it needed to. I would like to court you properly, he said, if you are willing. I am aware that you came here to build something of your own, and I would not have you think for a moment that what I am saying has anything to do with altering the independence you have made here. I mean only that I would like to be with you, as plainly as I can put it, to spend more time with you than Tuesdays allow. Rose Hayes looked at Thomas Ellsworth in the brilliant winter light of the New Mexico territory and thought about $12 and a recipe card and a woman's handwriting that said, for someone with a wandering spirit. She had not come here to find this. She had come here to find herself, or rather to find the version of herself that had been disappearing in a narrow house on a narrow street, and she had found her, working in a kitchen and learning the altitude of the air and making something real in the red dust. But the wandering spirit her aunt had written for had not, she thought, been a spirit that was meant to wander alone forever. Yes, she said, I am willing. The winter was the most beautiful season Rose had yet seen, and she had not expected to say that. She had expected winter in the desert to be barren and bleak, but it was not. It was spare and quiet in a way that made every detail more visible. The bare branches of the cottonwood silver against the blue sky, the red rock brilliant without the summer haze, the snow that came in February lying soft and extraordinary on the canyon floors, while the sky above remained that impossible blue. She and Thomas spent their Sunday afternoons together with a regularity that became simply part of the fabric of the week, as established and necessary as the baking schedule and the Tuesday mornings. They rode out to the formations and the canyon lands. They walked along the creek when the weather allowed. He showed her the cattle operation one afternoon, and she saw the way he moved through that space, easy and purposeful, the way you move through a place that is yours not in the legal sense but in the deeper sense of having been shaped by it, and having shaped it in return. She brought honey cake to the bunkhouse that afternoon for his 3 men, who were named Julio, Pete, and a taciturn giant from Tennessee called Sam, and they received it with the gratitude of men who had been eating their own cooking in the wilderness for too long. "She is a good cook," Sam said to Thomas with perfect seriousness, as though this was information Thomas might not have had. "I am aware," Thomas said. "Better than yours," Sam said. "Everyone is better than mine," Thomas said, which made Rose laugh, that laugh she no longer tried to contain. The courtship, as Thomas had called it, was in some ways the most natural thing Rose had ever experienced, because it was not a performance. They were not showing each other their best versions. They were just spending time together and continuing to become known to each other. And what they found as the knowing deepened was not disappointment, but something better than they had started with. In March, when the days were beginning to lengthen and the frost was losing its edge in the mornings, Thomas asked Rose to ride out with him to the Eastern Canyon, the one with the high walls and the pool at the bottom that caught the afternoon light. It was a place they had been twice before, and Rose brought her notebook and the honey cake and the coffee thermos as had become their habit. They sat at the edge of the pool and watched the light on the water, and Rose drew the canyon walls with the particular attention of a woman who had come to love the specific quality of light in this territory, the way it was different here from anywhere else she had been. Thomas sat beside her and watched her draw for a while, and then he said, "I want to ask you something." Rose put her pencil down. Thomas was looking at the pool, not at her, with the expression of a man who had rehearsed something and is now uncertain whether the rehearsal was adequate preparation for the reality. He turned to look at her, and the afternoon light caught the gray-green of his eyes, and he said, "I would like you to marry me. I have thought about it carefully and at length, which you might expect of me. I would like to spend my life with you, Rose, not instead of what you are building here, but alongside it. I want to build things alongside you." He reached into his shirt pocket and brought out a small ring, not a fine jeweler's piece, but a silver band with a single piece of turquoise set simply in it, the stone the color of the New Mexico sky and clearly made by a craftsman in the territory. "Inez's brother had it made," Thomas said, with slight stiffness that told her this had involved coordination and vulnerability. "I described the color you seem to like, the blue of the sky here. She said you were always looking at the sky." Rose looked at the ring and looked at Thomas Ellsworth and thought that she had been wrong about one thing when she arrived in Cobber Creek. She had thought that $12 and a recipe card were the most important things she had brought with her. But what she had actually brought with her, the wandering spirit and the willingness to sit across from a man and tell him honestly that she had $12 and a recipe and let him decide whether that was enough, that had been the most important thing. Everything else had come from that. "Yes," she said, for the third time in their acquaintance, and found that it carried more weight with repetition rather than less. He put the ring on her finger and she put her hand over his, and they sat with their hands together at the edge of the canyon pool in the afternoon light, and it was, Rose thought, one of the finest moments she had ever occupied. They were married in June, in the small adobe church with the rusted bell that turned out to make a remarkably clear tone when it was finally rung for the occasion. Inez and Diego and their children came. Carlos Vega made the journey from Albuquerque with his wife and brought a wedding gift of supplies for the eating house. Horace Finch attended in his best coat and cried in the way that older men who pretend not to be sentimental cry, which is loudly and without acknowledgement. Samuel Bird from the saddle shop came and sat in the back and nodded with great solemnity. Thomas's men, Julio and Pete and the enormous Sam, sat in a row and wore their cleanest shirts and looked proud. Porter, the land agent, served as one of the witnesses, which seemed appropriate given his role in the beginning of the whole arrangement. Rose wore a dress she had made herself from pale blue cotton fabric she had ordered through Carlos's trading line, the color of the turquoise in her ring, and she carried a small bunch of the desert flowers that grew along the creek bank, yellow and white, and the deep rust red of the canyon walls. Thomas wore his good coat, and the hat he had apparently purchased new for the occasion, which Julio later told Rose in a tone of amused reverence was only the second new hat Thomas had owned in 8 years. The vows were short and direct, as suited both of them. The minister, a traveling Methodist who came through Cobber Creek every 6 weeks, asked the traditional words, and they answered them with equal conviction. Thomas held her hands through the whole of it, and Rose looked at his face, at the openness in it, the total absence of the careful neutrality he had maintained for months at the beginning, and thought that this was what he looked like when he had decided entirely on something. Afterward, Inez had organized what could only be described as a feast in the street outside the church, tables brought from several households and loaded with food. Rose's honey cake was there, 3 of them, which Inez had made herself as a wedding contribution, and they disappeared within the first hour. Horace Finch made a toast with a glass of the saloon's best whiskey, and said that Rose Hayes had come to Cobber Creek and made the territory better, and that Thomas Ellsworth had shown more sense in the past year than in the entire decade before it, and that God willing they would both have the good judgment to stay. "I already intend to," Rose said, and held up her coffee cup, which was what she had instead of whiskey, and everyone laughed. They moved into Thomas's ranch house at the edge of the cattle operation, which was a clean, spare adobe house with 4 rooms and a kitchen that Rose immediately and happily invaded. She kept the eating house running, coming in 4 mornings and 3 evenings a week, with Maria and now a second helper, a young woman named Clara who had come up from the Mexican settlement and had a gift for the front room work that Rose recognized and fostered. The eating house was fully hers in practice and in spirit, and the fact of her marriage to Thomas changed nothing about that. If anything, the stability of the ranch house and the deep, easy comfort of their domestic life together freed something in her creative attention, and the menu expanded through that summer and fall in ways she was proud of. She developed 3 new recipes in the kitchen of the ranch house, where she had more space and the freedom to experiment without the pressure of service. 2 of them became immediate staples of the Hayes eating house menu. The third, a rich spiced apple cake made from the small tart apples that grew wild in the mountain canyon, she set aside and labeled in her own handwriting on a fresh recipe card, "For someone with a wandering spirit." It seemed right to keep the tradition going. Thomas came to the eating house every Tuesday morning still, and they still sat across from each other at their table in the morning light. But now when he left, he went back to the ranch house that was also hers, and she went back to it in the evenings, and there was a particular quality to the whole arc of those days, the completeness of them, that Rose sometimes stopped and simply looked at with the kind of gratitude that had no word precise enough for it. Their first child was born in April of 1880, a boy they named James William Ellsworth, William for Thomas's father and James for no particular reason, except that Thomas looked at the infant and said the name quietly, and it seemed to fit. James was a healthy, loud, opinionated child from his first day, with his father's gray-green eyes and Rose's tendency toward strong opinions expressed clearly, which Thomas noted with a mix of pride and fond resignation. Having James changed the rhythm of things, as children do, in the most fundamental way. Rose adjusted the eating house hours to allow for nursing and the consuming, miraculous work of the early months, leaning more heavily on Maria and Clara, who managed the operation with impressive capability. Thomas took to fatherhood with the same total commitment he brought to everything he decided on, and the sight of him with James in the early evenings, sitting in the rocker on the ranch house porch in the long golden light of the territorial dusk, was something Rose drew in her notebook, and then set aside because the drawing was not adequate to the reality of it. Thomas looked at James the way he looked at the territory, with a kind of gratitude so fundamental it had stopped being a feeling and had become just a fact of how he existed. The cattle operation grew steadily through 1880 and into 1881. Thomas added 20 head in a second corral and brought on a 4th man, a quiet Texan named Abel, and there was talk in Cobber Creek of the Ellsworth operation, becoming one of the more significant in the region, which Thomas received with the same careful attention he brought to all assessments. Listening, calibrating, not getting ahead of the facts. Rose opened a second room at the eating house in the fall of 1880, breaking through the wall into what had been Mrs. Dawson's old front parlor, and adding 6 more tables. The expansion brought the total capacity to 40, which on busy evenings they used entirely. Carlos Vega's supply line had grown into a more formalized arrangement by this point, with monthly deliveries and a standing order that reflected the scale of what Rose was operating. She taught Inez to make the honey cake so that Inez could produce it when Rose was occupied with James in the early months, a transfer of knowledge that Inez received with a seriousness that honored the recipe's history. Rose told her about Meredith and the recipe card, about what the cake meant and where it came from, and Inez listened with the attentive respect of a woman who understood that recipes carried stories in them. "Your aunt knew what she was doing," Inez said, when Rose had finished telling the story. "She usually did," Rose agreed. The territory changed in those years, as all frontier territories eventually did, the change coming not dramatically but cumulatively, new people arriving and old dynamics shifting, and the particular wildness of the place being slowly and imperfectly organized into something more settled. The Apache conflicts that had defined the region's violence for decades had shifted significantly by this period, the government's brutal resettlement policies having extracted a terrible cost, and Rose felt the weight of that history in the land itself. In the faces of the Apache people she occasionally saw passing through the territory. The injustice of what had been done to people who had lived in these canyon lands for generations longer than any white settler was not something she could correct, but she was conscious of it, and she made sure her eating house was a place where everyone who came in good faith could eat, at a time when that was not as obvious a principle as it should have been. Thomas agreed with this. He had worked alongside men of many origins in the territory, and had developed the kind of respect for the actual capacities of individual people that comes from watching people work under difficult conditions, and he had no patience for the uglier strains of prejudice that ran through the territory's social life. They had one conversation about it early in their marriage, brief but complete, and found that they were exactly aligned, which pleased Rose in the deep way that fundamental agreement on important things pleases people who have decided to share a life. Their second child came in August of 1882, a daughter they named Clara Meredith Ellsworth, the Meredith for Rose's aunt, and Clara from the moment she arrived was a quiet, watchful child with Rose's dark hair and what Thomas called her studying expression, which Rose recognized as the look of a person cataloging the world with great attention. James, who was 2.5 by then and had strong opinions about everything, was initially uncertain about his sister and then abruptly devoted to her, appointing himself her guardian with an earnestness that made both his parents quietly laugh. The eating house passed its 4th year of operation in the summer of 1882 with a dinner to celebrate, which Rose organized herself and which drew half the town. Inez and Diego came and brought their whole family. Thomas's 3 original men came, and Abel and Horace Finch, and Porter the land agent, and the rotating collection of miners and ranchers and travelers who had made Hayes' eating house part of their understanding of what Cobber Creek was. Horace Finch said, during the dinner, that the town was better for Rose's presence in it, and that he had known it from the moment she walked into his store on that first afternoon 4 years ago with her carpet bag and her $12 and her recipe card, and the expression of a woman who had decided something and was not interested in being talked out of it. "What did you think?" someone asked him, when she first walked in. Horace Finch looked at Rose with the warm, slightly tearful expression he always wore at moments of genuine emotion. "I thought she was going to be trouble," he said, "in the best possible way, the kind of trouble that improves things. Rose laughed, and Thomas beside her laughed too, and he put his hand briefly over hers on the table, and she turned her hand so their fingers interlaced, and they sat like that for the rest of the evening, in the warm golden light of the eating house that had begun with $12 and a recipe and a man saying, with complete conviction, that it was enough to begin. There were more years after that, good years, the kind that stack one against the other with enough variation to be interesting and enough stability to be genuinely sustaining. James grew into a serious, capable boy who showed, by the time he was 5, an interest in the cattle operation that gratified Thomas in the quiet, deep way that good things gratify people who have worked for them. He followed Thomas on the property with an attention that Thomas received with a kind of wonder he could not always conceal, and Rose watched the two of them from the kitchen window sometimes on Sunday mornings, the tall man and the small boy moving through the morning with the same purposeful ease, and felt something so large it did not fit inside her chest. Clara grew into a child of remarkable perceptiveness, who noticed things adults did not notice, and remembered everything and asked questions with a directness that was her mother's entirely. At 4, she asked Rose what the recipe card in her coat pocket was, and Rose sat down and told her the whole story, the ant and the wandering spirit and the $12 and the stage from St. Louis, and the man in the saddle shop who had said that was enough to begin. Clara listened to all of it with her studying expression and then said, "And then you married him." "And then I married him," Rose confirmed. "Was he already nice," Clara said, "or did he become nice?" Thomas was standing in the kitchen doorway and heard this, and something moved in his expression that Rose would always remember. "He was already nice," Rose said carefully, smiling. "He just had to decide to say so." Clara considered this with the gravity of a 4-year-old engaging with important information. "I see," she said, in the tone of a person filing this away. Thomas came into the kitchen and picked Clara up with the easy, practiced movement of a father of 2 and said, "Your mother is being generous." "She said you were already nice," Clara reported faithfully. "She also said I had to decide to say so," Thomas said, with the self-awareness that Rose had come to love in him, the way he could look at himself clearly without either excessive criticism or excessive self-congratulation. He put Clara down and she went off into the other room with the sudden decisive movement of small children who have finished with a conversation, and Thomas turned to Rose and looked at her with the openness, the full, complete openness, that had been in his face the day she had agreed to marry him and had never fully gone away since. "She is right," he said, "about the generous part." Rose was at the work table, her hands already moving toward the evening's baking, because the hands found their way there automatically after 5 years of practice. She looked at her husband with 12 years of knowing him settling in her like the honey in the cake, which was to say completely and sweetly and without granularity. "You came and fixed my roof," she said, "before I could even pay you rent." "The roof needed fixing," he said. "You spoke to Carlos Vega about my supply line before Webb's offer had even landed." "I wanted to be useful," he said, with a slight stiffness that was Thomas Ellsworth defending himself against being caught at something generous. "You were already nice," Rose said firmly. "You just had to decide to say so." He looked at her for a moment with the expression that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood, and then he crossed the kitchen and stood beside her at the work table and put his hand on the back of her neck very gently, and she leaned into it for a moment before turning back to the baking, because the bread did not make itself. The story might have ended there in that kitchen, in that contentment. But the better stories always have one more thing, one final thing that gathers up everything that has come before and shows you what it has amounted to. It came in the fall of 1884, 6 years after Rose had stepped off the stage in Cobber Creek with her $12 and her recipe card. On a Tuesday morning when Thomas was at his usual table with his usual coffee and James was at school, and Clara was playing on the rug with a collection of stones she had arranged into a pattern that made sense only to her. Horace Finch came into the eating house with the energy of a man carrying news, which was an energy Rose had learned to identify because Horace had brought her news before, good and bad, and carried both with the same forward-leaning urgency. "Someone has inquired about the old Dawson building," he said to Thomas. Thomas looked at him over his coffee cup. "This is still my building, Horace." "I know it is," Horace said, pulling up a chair and sitting down without being invited, which was the privilege of 6 years of friendship. "I am telling you because the inquiry came from a young woman off the stage from El Paso who walked into my store and asked about commercial space, and I thought of what Rose did 6 years ago and thought perhaps you might be interested to know." Thomas and Rose looked at each other across the table. "What kind of young woman?" Rose asked. "Determined sort," Horace said. "Dark hair. Came in with a bag over her shoulder and looked at everything in the store like she was pricing up the territory." He paused. "She had $3 and a letter of introduction to a seamstress operation in Santa Fe that turns out to have closed. I do not know what else she has, but she looked like the kind of woman who would figure something out." Thomas set his coffee cup down and looked at Rose with a very particular expression. Rose thought about a stage stop in the summer heat and a man in a saddle shop and a question about whether $12 and a recipe were enough to begin. She thought about what Thomas had said and what it had meant and what had come from it. "Ask her to come in," Rose said to Horace. Horace left to find the young woman, and Thomas looked at Rose across the table with the expression that was not quite a smile but was entirely in its territory. "You are going to offer her the back room," he said. "You own the building," Rose said. "I cannot offer her anything." "Then I will offer her the back room," Thomas said, "which you will assist in setting up, and you will teach her whatever she needs to know, and before long she will have something going that will surprise everybody." Rose looked at her husband and felt the particular warmth of loving someone for a specific, definite reason, not the vague warmth of general affection, but the clear heat of knowing why. "You were always going to say yes," she said. $3 and a letter of introduction to a closed business," Thomas said. "Of course I was going to say yes." The young woman's name was Nora Castillo, and she was 20 years old and had come to the territory from El Paso with a skill for fine needlework and the particular kind of determination that comes from having no alternative plan. She sat at the table in Hayes' eating house and drank the coffee Rose put in front of her and answered Thomas's practical questions with a directness that made him look at Rose with a slight expression she recognized as, "Yes, this will be fine." He offered her the back room of the Dawson building, which Rose had been using for additional storage but could easily do without, at a fair rent beginning when the business was generating income. He told her about the supply connections, about Inez and Carlos Vega's network, about the way the town worked. Nora Castillo listened to all of it and then looked from Thomas to Rose and back, with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone receiving more help than they had expected from a world that had not always been generous with it. "Why?" she said, which was blunt and honest and exactly the right question. Thomas and Rose looked at each other. "Because someone said yes to me once," Rose said, "when I had $12 and a recipe and not much else, and I have been looking for the right moment to return the favor ever since." Nora looked at Rose's hand on the table, at the turquoise ring, at the eating house around them, at the children's drawings pinned to the wall beside the kitchen door, at all the evidence of a life built from small and determined beginnings. "Thank you," she said, and it was the kind of thank you that carried the weight of something that mattered. "Come back tomorrow," Rose said. "I will introduce you to Inez Gallardo, who knows more about how to establish yourself in this territory than anyone I have met, and she will be glad to know you." Nora Castillo left with a better set of prospects than she had arrived with, and the door swung shut behind her, and the eating house was quiet for a moment in the way It was between the breakfast rush and the midday service. Thomas reached across the table and picked up Rose's hand and turned it so the turquoise ring caught the morning light, the blue-green of it the color of the sky over the canyon walls. "We should go back to the Eastern Canyon this Sunday," he said. "The light in October is the best." "It is always the best, according to you," Rose said. "It is always the best," Thomas agreed simply. She looked at their hands on the table, his large and work-worn, hers smaller but equally accustomed to work. And she thought about the Tuesday morning 6 years ago when she had put a folded recipe card on her knee and looked at a man in a saddle shop and told him the truth. $12, one recipe, and nothing else. And he had looked back at her and said what he said, as though it was obvious, as though there was never any question, as though the right person with the right thing had all they needed for whatever came next. That is enough to begin. And it had been. It had been more than enough. It had been everything. Outside, Cobber Creek went about its morning with the unhurried pace of a town that knew what it was. The blacksmith's forge breathing its daily breath, the cottonwoods along the creek in their October gold, the stage road running east and west through the red rock country toward all the directions a person with a wandering spirit might come from. The eating house smelled of coffee and fresh bread, and the particular combination of beeswax and wood smoke and good food that had, over 6 years, become the smell of the thing itself. The smell that meant home to miners coming in from the cold and ranchers at the end of the trail, and travelers stepping off the stage with their bags and their uncertain hopes. And in the kitchen, the honey cake recipe sat on its shelf in Rose's handwriting, the card she had copied from Meredith's original and added her own notes to over the years, the altitude adjustments Inez had taught her, the small change she had made to the spicing in her 2nd year, the note about the pine honey that her aunt had written and that Rose had kept because it was true, and because it was her aunt's voice, and because some things deserved to be preserved. At the bottom, in Rose's own hand, 3 words that Meredith had not written and Rose had added, because it seemed to her after everything that had happened that they were the most important part of any recipe she had ever made. Share it freely. James came home from school at 4 in the afternoon and ate 2 biscuits standing at the kitchen counter, and told his mother about his day with the particular velocity of a 7-year-old who has been waiting since morning to report important information. Clara sat on the porch steps drawing her stones into new patterns. Thomas rode in from the east pasture as the sun was going down, the roan gelding moving at the easy lope he used when he was not in a hurry, and he rode into the yard and swung down, and unsaddled the horse with the movements of a man at the end of a good day's work. Rose stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him, and he looked up and saw her there, and the expression that came onto his face was the same expression it had been for 6 years. Entirely open, entirely real, the careful neutrality gone so completely that it was hard to remember it had ever been there. He crossed the yard and came up the steps and kissed her briefly and thoroughly, in the way they always greeted each other at the end of the working day, with the practiced ease of people who have been greeting each other for long enough that the ease is real and not performed. "Good day," he said. "Very good," Rose said. "A young woman came in from El Paso." "I heard," he said. "Horace told me after he left the eating house. He seemed pleased with himself." "He should be," Rose said. "He was right to send her to us." They went inside together, into the kitchen that smelled of the evening meal she had started before leaving the eating house, and James immediately redirected his velocity from his mother to his father, and Clara came in from the porch with her stones, and showed Thomas the new pattern with the seriousness she brought to all her work, and Thomas received it with equal seriousness, which was exactly right. Rose stood at the stove and stirred and listened to her family in the kitchen around her, the specific sounds of it, and thought about a stage road and a summer afternoon and $12, and a recipe card worn at the edges from all the distance it had traveled, and the man who had looked at her with his gray-green eyes and said what he said. She thought about all the things that had grown from that beginning. The eating house and its 40 seats. The supply network and Inez's friendship and Carlos, Vega's reliable wagons. The honey cake made now in 3 kitchens in Cobber Creek and counting. The 2 children who had her aunt's wandering spirit and Thomas's steadiness, and who would, she thought, make extraordinary things of their own someday. She thought about Nora Castillo and the back room and what would come from that, the small stitch of continuity between one person's beginning and another's, the way good things propagate outward when you let them. She put her hand in her coat pocket out of old habit, and her fingers found the recipe card that she still kept there, worn now beyond softness into something almost like cloth, the handwriting faded but still entirely legible in her aunt's looping script. She did not need to take it out to read it. She had it completely by heart. Thomas looked at her from across the kitchen, one hand on James's shoulder, Clara's stone arrangement held carefully in his other hand, and he looked at her with the complete attention that was one of the things she loved most about him, the way he looked at her like he was still learning something, even now. She put the recipe card back in her pocket and smiled at her husband, and he smiled back, that rare and significant smile that arrived in the corners of his eyes and eased his whole expression. And outside the New Mexico territory went on being itself, ancient and vast and full of red rock and blue sky and the smell of sage and dust, and the particular kind of freedom that the West had always promised, and occasionally, under the right circumstances, actually delivered. It was all, Rose thought, watching him watch her, more than enough. It always had been.